So the next section, after STDs, we're going to go back to the babies. We're going to talk about development. So we're going to talk about development through young life. We've already kind of talked about puberty because we've talked about secondary sexual characteristics, so we're not going to really talk about pubertal development anymore. And then we're going to talk about aging. So this section is about the first part and the last part of a human life. Is that there's a lot of stages. Stuff goes through stages. Physical stages, mental stages, kind of overlapping stages. One of the things that changes through the course of life is your proportions. When you looked at the embryo, the developed embryo was almost 1/3 head. And a newborn baby is not quite that, but it's much more head than it is later in life. If you're an artist, you learn to draw babies and kids and stuff, you draw them so many heads high, and an adult is more heads high than a baby or a child is. Sometimes when you look at old paintings, and you're trying to figure out why the kids look weird, sometimes it's the features, but a lot of times it's the proportions, is that they drew a kid face, but the proportions on the body are wrong. They have more of an adult proportion. That means that your head is going to grow through your lifetime, but nowhere near as much as the rest of you. So your brain isn't going to do that much more growing than the rest of you as well. So your proportions change. Your bones are going to change. They've been calcifying during fetal development, but the proportion of calcium to protein, there's what they call collagen in your bones that gives them some flexing ability so they don't just snap. Calcium carbonate, what your bones are made out of that's hard, is pretty easy to break unless it's got some give to it. You wind up with the same thing if you're building a concrete wall or cement wall, is they put steel rods in it that give a little bit of flex in the wind so the wall doesn't just go too far and just fall over, just snap. And in a baby, in a kid, there's a lot more protein in relation to the calcium, which means that the bones break differently if they do break. They're much more flexible, they don't break as easily, they don't have to support as much weight, so they don't have to be as strong. And when they do break, they cause what are called green stick fractures. They have a tendency to kind of fray at the break rather than just break sharp, snap, the way that they do when there's a lot more calcium to them. And the calcium to protein ratio is going to change later on in aging as well. Something happens in your lungs. Now, as a fetus, late in development, you do a little bit of breathing, but you're in a big bag of fluid. You're breathing amniotic fluid. So you do a little bit of pumping, but not a lot. And then you get born, the fluid either gets absorbed or you expel it, and you take in air. In order for oxygen to get into your blood and carbon dioxide to get out of your blood into the air and go back out, you need the surface in your lung the surface has to be wet. Oxygen won't move. Oxygen doesn't move through this very well, but it moves through a wet surface really well. So think about a plastic bag that's got a little bit of water in it. And you try to open it and it just sticks shut. You open it and it just sticks shut. That's a problem with the little bubbles that you have in your lungs that oxygen moves out of, carbon dioxide moves into. You breathe out, you squeeze the bubbles shut. They're wet, which makes them sticky. And then you need to reinflate them with air. That takes force. It's not enough force, it's not force that an infant can easily exert. So what you need coating the linings of your breathing spaces is something called surfactant. So we talked about proportions. You probably already wrote this down. By now you should be used to this. We talked about bones. I'm talking about lungs, and I'm talking about surfactant. Surfactant is one of the later things that you make. Premature babies have not always started to produce surfactant. So they are going to have problems reinflating their lungs when they breathe out. Is that a lot of people get confused over just exactly what's going on here. You breathe out, the bubbles collapse, they stick together. You need the surfactant to make them less sticky. Soap does that too. I've never tried it with a plastic bag, but I assume if I put soapy water in there, it would open up easier. Anyway, the surfactant allows your lungs to reinflate after you've breathed out. And if a premature baby doesn't have that, you either have to give them a little bit of pressure, push the air in with them, or spray surfactant into their systems, which is what they do with with babies that are really having trouble inhaling. Is that they used to actually harvest sheep surfactant. Now they've got an artificial one that I'm pretty sure was developed at Albany Medical Center. I seem to remember reading that years ago. But it is an important part of being able to breathe, even for us, is the surfactant is still made in our lungs, so it isn't that hard to pop those little bubbles back open. This one is not really physical, but because it's here, we're talking about the lungs, I'm gonna put it in here anyway. This is more of a brain thing. Okay. We'll talk about this later too. In your blood, you have oxygen and carbon dioxide. You need the oxygen. The carbon dioxide you want to get rid of. The oxygen is in your red blood cells stuck to your hemoglobin. If you're trying to detect how much oxygen you have in your blood, that's not really accessible to the monitors you have. Your monitors are up in the base of your brain. It's easier to track carbon dioxide because it's literally dissolved in the plasma, so it's much more readable. So in controlling your breathing pace, your brain goes, up, too much carbon dioxide, we gotta breathe more. It doesn't read oxygen levels. When you sleep, you're not active, you're not using a lot of oxygen, you're not generating a huge amount of carbon dioxide. Your breathing gets much more irregular. There's a whole cottage industry on sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, to some extent, is normal. People's breathing gets erratic when they sleep, sometimes long gaps between inhalations. That's a problem because remember, the brain isn't that well developed in an infant, and the feedback that goes up, 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 we need to breathe again, may not be developed as much as it's supposed to be. And so they go to sleep, they stop breathing because their brain goes, man, we don't, take a breath, let it out, okay. And then when we would get the message, breathe again, we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide, get more oxygen in, the brain doesn't send that out. I think a lot of you know what I'm talking about. This is sudden infant death syndrome. You stop breathing and you don't start again. And you don't ever, in some cases. So, and it's somewhat genetic. It is more connected to development. It's a little bit more common in preemies than it is and as you get older, it goes away. I discovered when a friend of mine's baby died of SIDS that it didn't count as SIDS anymore because she was more than a year old, and at some point they changed the definitions and they only counted SIDS, at least around here, up to a 12-month-old. Now I know from reading about SIDS for many years, it happens in older kids. It gets much, much rarer. And I don't know why they've decided that 12 months was the threshold, but apparently somebody somewhere did. Haven't seen any research to indicate that that makes sense. Sometimes in medicine, they just do these weird definitional things. I don't know. But if you have, it does run in families, so sometimes people will buy, what the monitor does is it times the breathing. And if too much time has gone by since the last breath, an alarm goes off. Now, in most cases, the alarm, wakes up the baby goes, and they breathe. So, parents respond to the alarm and it's like everything seems to be fine. I don't know this, I would assume the alarms have records on them now so you could actually see what was going on. I know what the old alarms were like. And you can hopefully not pick the baby up and shake it, but get the baby to wake up and take a breath. And that's what the monitors are looking for. What exactly is going on to produce this in some babies more than others, what the gene is connected to, they're still trying to puzzle out. And what position you put the baby in that changes over time. There'll be a few years where they gotta be face up, then there'll be a few years they gotta be on their side, and then it's a few years you gotta put it face down to make sure the head's turned to the side and don't put anything in there they can smother on. And it seems to have settled recently. It's been the same for a few years, but don't be surprised if you learn something when you had your baby, and then later on somebody goes, oh no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it, you're supposed to do it this way. And when you go, I don't think I'm remembering that wrong, you're right, you're probably remembering it right, and they've just changed it in the meantime. Oh, my notes are over here. So this goes into changes in the brain. Now, anybody that's dealt with babies and little kids knows that one of the things your brain has to develop for, and it goes through stages for this, is your ability to coordinate your muscles. Something as simple as playing ball, right? You got a little bitty kid, you toss this big softball at them and it bounces off their face and drops to the ground, and they laugh, but they don't really know what to do about it. They eventually get the idea that they're supposed to grab it, but they can't time it because they can't control their muscles. And then they kind of do this, and it's like shooting a basket into their arms and they catch it. And when they get to the point where you give them a small ball, is that they throw it and it goes that way because it comes off of their hand wrong and it goes behind them rather than in front of them. But eventually they can, to one extent or another, do that. You're watching their brain develop its coordination abilities, be able to put together what you want to do with the messages going to your muscles, and that does change over time. Connected to that is language. This is a very complicated coordination activity, and babies are not capable of doing that for a long time. With the studies we've talked about a little bit, where they've gotten better at trying to figure out what's going on in babies' brains, and there has been research to indicate that babies understand language a lot more than we think they do, and the reason we don't think they do is because they can't respond, but they don't have the coordination to respond. Babbling is basically a practice approach to being able to put those sounds together, ba, 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 ba. And of course, anybody who's got a mother and been around mothers and fathers is that the ability to make an M sound is there earlier than the ability to make a D sound. So mama comes quicker than dada, even papa, because of the way that you have to breathe through in order to make the P sound, tends to come after mama. Is that don't take it personally. We've got a certain preset programming for language. Basic language seems to be in our brains right at the beginning. You can actually see it working out in our relatives. Apes have an ability to understand language. Hell, dogs have a decent ability to understand language. Cats have an ability, but they don't care. And then what you take is the basics of language, and then you kind of lay the structure of your individual language on top of that. So there are basic constructs of language, and then every language takes and fiddles with that. So in English especially, is that for a while kids will make mistakes because they don't really understand the exceptions of grammar. Why did we not go to the zoo? No, we went to the zoo, but we go, don't we go? They understand the rules. They start applying the rules, and then it takes them a while to realize, well, that rule doesn't work for this. And in English, there's a lot of exceptions. So English is a tricky one to learn. Being able to reason, what they call cognitive development, definitely goes in stages as well. The stages are well worked out. Simple things is that you take a tall, narrow glass and a squat, wide glass, and you put them in front of somebody. And you go, so which one of these holds more water? And most people will look at it and go, well, I think it's the tall one. But if you fill the tall one up to the top and pour it into the short one and it fills up to the top, you go, oh, okay. I wasn't sure, but obviously they hold the same amount of water. Well, up to a certain point of age, a certain level of development, you can show that to a little kid. But a couple of days later, you give them the same choice, they're gonna pick the tall one. They can't hold on to the idea that the volumes are equal. To them, high is bigger than low. And that's a cognitive development stage. Can you push them through the stages faster? Big question in education. Do kids just go at their own pace, or can they be accelerated? Big argument between the Piagetians. Piaget was a Swiss guy. He experimented on his kids and he developed all sorts of cognitive measurements and came up with developmental levels and stuff. And he was absolutely sure that kids just developed as they developed, is that you couldn't push them any faster. They'd get over the threshold when they got over the threshold. And then you get like Spinner, which is kind of the basis for our whole education system, which is you put them in class and you give them stuff and you try to keep everybody going at the same pace. And it works reasonably well, but that's because the kids are roughly the same age and their paces are gonna be roughly equal, but some of them aren't and some of them are. So should we do more of a Montessori, learn at your own pace kind of approach? Should we do it's a big educational argument that never seems, you would think that you'd be able to test that fairly well and settle it. But it's, again, one of those things where you kind of get what you're looking for when you run those kinds of tests. Big thing, emotional development. Your brain is more than just thinking and reasoning, it's also connecting to other people. You can think of that as empathy. Your ability to understand that what is happening in someone else's brain isn't the same as what's happening in your brain. Then you can feel for them. How many times have we said to a kid, well, how would you feel if so-and-so did that to you? And if they go, I wouldn't care, then the implication is that I don't know why they would care, because they don't quite grasp that other people's brains don't work the same way as theirs. When this doesn't develop properly, that is basically what you have with autism. An inability to be able to figure out that what's happening in here isn't the same as what's happening in that other person's brain. And it's very confusing if your brain doesn't develop along those lines. Is kids with severe autism tend to withdraw from the world. They settle into things that they can trust, doing the same thing over and over and over. They don't like to deal with people. They don't like people coming in contact with them. Is that it's all too mysterious and confusing for them to be able to deal. Whereas there are kids that are somewhat impaired in that development. Asperger's syndrome is, autism, they've kind of expanded into this whole range of things that are all more or less based on this inability to connect to other people. One of the hallmarks of Asperger's syndrome is, if I have Asperger's, then I don't understand why the things that I'm interested in, everybody isn't interested in that. I don't understand where, if I think this is the way something should happen, why everybody doesn't understand that's the way things should happen. Because I don't quite grasp how their brains get other answers than mine. And I don't really understand when they give me stuff that doesn't work the way that, I say something to them and they get mad at me. I don't know, I wouldn't have gotten mad at that. Don't they know what I meant? And if you know, this ability to understand other people's brains is a huge continuum in all people. So, I'm not that great at it. In some cases, some ways I'm pretty good at it, some ways I'm horrible at it. And that's true for most everybody. We're gonna stop this and we'll pick it up for aging in the next one.